January 2nd, 1963, and the small village of Ap Bac sits in the Mekong Delta 40 miles southwest of Saigon, a collection of thatched huts and rice paddies that appears no different from thousands of other hamlets scattered across South Vietnam. But today, this obscure village will become the site of the first major battle, where American military doctrine and technology and advisors supporting the Army of the Republic of Vietnam face Viet Cong forces willing to stand and fight in daylight, rather than melting away into jungle, as they have done countless times before. And the outcome will shock American commanders and expose fundamental problems in the advisory effort that will plague the war for the next 12 years until final defeat. This is 1963, and the American commitment to South Vietnam remains limited to advisors and equipment and air support, with no American combat troops on the ground because President Kennedy has determined that South Vietnamese forces must fight their own war with American guidance and material support. The strategic hamlet program is underway, with villages being fortified and defended, and the ARVN is being trained and equipped with the latest American weapons and tactics. And optimistic reports flow to Washington suggesting that the war against the Viet Cong insurgency is being won through this combination of American expertise and South Vietnamese manpower. The Battle of Ap Bac will shatter these illusions completely. Intelligence reports indicate that a Viet Cong radio transmitter company of approximately 300 fighters has taken position in Ap Bac village, and this presents an opportunity that ARVN commanders cannot ignore, because catching VC forces in the open, where superior firepower can be brought to bear, represents the kind of engagement that should result in easy victory for government forces. The 7th ARVN Division, commanded by Colonel Bui Din Dam, will conduct the operation, with 3 infantry battalions and armoured personnel carriers and artillery support, and American helicopters for transport and close air support, fielding over 2,000 soldiers against an estimated 300 VC fighters, in what appears on paper to be an overwhelming advantage that should guarantee success. American advisors are present at every level of command, with Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann serving as senior advisor to the 7th Division, and Vann is an experienced and aggressive officer who believes strongly that the war can be won if ARVN forces are properly led and willing to close with the enemy and fight. But he will discover today that neither of these conditions applies, and his frustration at watching a winnable battle turn into humiliating defeat will lead him to speak publicly about ARVN failures in ways that begin eroding the official optimism being presented to the American public and to Washington decision-makers. The plan is straightforward and follows standard doctrine for this type of operation. Civil Guard forces will advance from the south while the 8th Airborne Battalion inserts by helicopter to the north, blocking escape routes, and the armoured personnel carriers from Task Force A will advance from the west while the 11th Infantry Regiment moves from the east, creating an encirclement that should trap the VC in Ap Bac village, where they can be systematically destroyed by superior firepower. On paper, the plan is sound and the force ratios are favourable, and success seems assured, but war is not fought on paper, and the human factors of courage and leadership and willingness to accept casualties will prove far more important than numerical superiority or technological advantage. The morning assault at 0700 hours on January 2nd, the operation begins as Civil Guard forces advance from the south toward Ap Bac through rice paddies that provide little cover, moving slowly and cautiously through terrain that is flat and open, with irrigation ditches being the only features offering any protection from fire. These Civil Guard troops are local militia of questionable training and motivation, led by officers who have obtained their positions through political connections rather than military competence, and they advance hesitantly while maintaining loose formations that suggest they are not eager to make contact with the enemy. The Viet Cong have prepared defensive positions throughout Ap Bac village, with fighting positions dug into rice paddy dikes and concealed in tree lines that provide excellent fields of fire across the open approaches, and they have positioned their heaviest weapons, including several Browning automatic rifles, and captured American M1 carbines and French rifles in positions that can concentrate fire on the most likely avenues of approach. The VC commander has made the decision to stand and fight rather than withdrawing before superior forces because he believes his positions are strong enough to inflict significant casualties, and he wants to demonstrate that Viet Cong forces can defeat government troops in conventional battle when properly prepared and aggressively led. As the Civil Guard forces close to within 300 metres of Ap Bac, the VC open fire with devastating effect, and the surprised government troops immediately go to ground, seeking whatever cover the rice paddy dikes provide, while returning fire ineffectively without visible targets to aim at because the VC are well concealed and firing from prepared positions that are difficult to identify. The volume of fire from the village is far heavier than expected, suggesting the VC force is larger than the intelligence estimated and better armed than typical VC units, and the Civil Guard advance stops completely as troops refuse to move forward into the fire, while their officers make no effort to rally them or organise coordinated assault. Lieutenant Colonel Van monitors the battle from a light observation aircraft circling overhead where he has clear view of the entire battlefield, and he can see that the Civil Guard forces have stopped advancing and are pinned down by fire while making no effort to manoeuvre or call for fire support, and his frustration begins building as he realises these troops are not going to accomplish their mission without aggressive leadership that appears to be completely absent. He radios suggestions and encouragement to the ground commanders, but his advice is politely acknowledged and then ignored as the Civil Guard soldiers remain in place, behind whatever cover they have found with no apparent intention of advancing further. Van decides to commit the reserve force earlier than planned because the southern advance has stalled completely, and he orders the 8th Airborne Battalion to insert by helicopter to the north of Ap Bac, where they can block VC escape routes, and potentially advance south into the village to link up with the Civil Guard forces attacking from the opposite direction. 10 H-21 Shawnee helicopters from the United States Army's 93rd Transportation Company prepare to lift the airborne troops, and these large twin-rotor helicopters represent the newest technology being employed in Vietnam with ability to transport troops rapidly over terrain that would take hours to cross on foot, theoretically providing mobility advantage that should allow government forces to maneuver faster than the enemy can react. The helicopters fall. At approximately 1000 hours, the formation of 10 H-21 helicopters approaches the landing zone north of Ap Bac, flying low and slow as they prepare to land and discharge their passengers, and the Viet Cong fighters in the village can hear them coming long before they appear, because the distinctive sound of twin rotors carries across the flat delta landscape. The VC have prepared for this possibility and have positioned their best marksmen with instructions to concentrate fire on the helicopters, because bringing down these machines will have enormous psychological impact while also preventing reinforcement of government forces, and every VC fighter understands that helicopters represent American power and technology, and that destroying them sends powerful message about VC capability and determination. The first helicopters begin their landing approach, and immediately the VC open fire with everything they have, concentrating multiple weapons on each aircraft in turn with disciplined fire rather than simply spraying bullets wildly into the sky. The H-21 Shawnees are large and slow and vulnerable targets as they descend toward the landing zone, and the concentrated fire proves devastatingly effective as rounds begin striking the aircraft with metallic impacts that can be heard even over the roar of the engines and rotors. The first helicopter is hit multiple times, and smoke begins trailing from the engine as the pilot fights to maintain control, and he manages to land hard in the rice paddy where troops scramble out before the aircraft settles, at an angle with rotors still turning uselessly. The second helicopter takes even more hits as it attempts landing near the first, and critical systems are damaged by the concentrated fire until control is lost completely, and the helicopter crashes hard into the rice paddy, with severe impact that injures several soldiers and leaves the aircraft damaged beyond any possibility of taking off again. The remaining helicopters in the formation immediately wave off and climb away from the landing zone seeking altitude and safety, while radioing that they are taking heavy fire and cannot land without being destroyed, and only 2 helicopters from the formation of 10 successfully delivered their troops to the intended landing zone, while the rest circle at safe distance waiting for the situation to develop. American helicopter crews and advisors are shocked by the intensity and accuracy of VC fire because previous operations have encountered only sporadic fire from VC forces who typically flee rather than concentrating to fight, and the realization that the VC have stood their ground and are fighting effectively comes as stunning surprise that contradicts the optimistic assessments that have been flowing to Saigon and Washington about inevitable government victory. The downed helicopters sit in the rice paddy north of Ap Bac, with crews and passengers taking cover while calling desperately for rescue or reinforcement, and their situation becomes increasingly desperate as VC fighters begin maneuvering to positions where they can direct effective fire on the stranded Americans and South Vietnamese soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Van watches this disaster unfold from his observation aircraft overhead, and immediately begins coordinating rescue efforts while simultaneously trying to get ground forces to advance and relieve the surrounded helicopter, Cruz, but he discovers to his mounting rage that the ARVN commanders are reluctant to move their forces into situations where they might take casualties, and that the concern for American prestige and the lives of American helicopter crewmen does not translate into urgency among South Vietnamese officers who seem content to wait for the situation to resolve itself somehow without requiring them to take risks. A third helicopter pilot decides to attempt landing near the downed aircraft to rescue the stranded crews despite the obvious danger and the warnings from those already on ground. And this act of courage proves fatal as the helicopter approaches the landing zone and immediately receives concentrated fire from multiple VC positions that have been reinforced specifically to prevent any rescue attempt. The helicopter is hit repeatedly with rounds, penetrating vital systems and striking crew members, and the pilot fights desperately to maintain control as the aircraft shudders and smoke pours from damaged engines, but control is lost and the helicopter crashes hard, killing the crew chief and seriously wounding others while completely blocking any further helicopter rescue attempts. By late morning, 3 American helicopters sit damaged or destroyed in rice paddies north of Ap Bac, with crews and passengers numbering approximately 15 Americans and 40 South Vietnamese soldiers stranded in defensive positions, taking fire from VC fighters who are growing increasingly bold and aggressive as they realize that government forces are not moving to rescue the trapped men. American advisors plead with ARVN commanders to advance and relieve these positions, but encounter only reluctance and excuses and delays that make clear the South Vietnamese officers have no intention of risking their troops to save helicopter crews, regardless of how many Americans might be killed if rescue does not come soon. Additional helicopter losses mount through the day as 2 more. Aircraft are shot down attempting various missions around Ap Bac, bringing the total to 5 helicopters destroyed or damaged beyond repair in a single day's fighting against an estimated 300 Viet Cong fighters armed primarily with small arms and automatic weapons. This represents the highest helicopter loss rate of the war to date, and demonstrates that American technological superiority means nothing when the enemy is willing to stand and fight, while friendly ground forces refuse to maneuver aggressively to exploit their numerical and firepower advantages. The armor refuses task force. Consisting of 13 M113 armored personnel carriers should represent overwhelming advantage for government forces because these tracked vehicles carry 50 caliber machine guns that should devastate enemy positions while providing protected transport for infantry who can dismount and assault under covering fire from the vehicles. The task force commander is Captain Lai Tong, Bar, a political appointee who owes his position to connections rather than competence, and who has demonstrated throughout his career that he prefers caution over aggression, and that preserving his own career and avoiding casualties matters more to him than accomplishing mission objectives or supporting other units in contact. American advisor Captain James Scanlon rides with Task Force A and watches with mounting disbelief and anger as Captain Bear refuses to advance his armoured vehicles toward Ap Bac despite direct orders from higher command and despite the desperate situation of the stranded helicopter crews who need immediate relief. Bear offers various excuses including concerns about mines and about becoming decisively engaged where his vehicles might be destroyed, but Scanlon recognises these as pretexts to avoid combat, and he becomes increasingly direct and forceful in his urgings that the task force must advance immediately because American lives depend on their support. The 13 armoured personnel carriers finally begin moving toward Ap Bac in late morning after repeated orders and threats from higher headquarters, advancing slowly across the rice paddies while maintaining excessive intervals between vehicles that prevent them from providing mutual support, and this hesitant movement telegraphs to both friendly and enemy forces that the commanders leading this advance have no real commitment to closing with the enemy and fighting. As the vehicles approach to within 500 metres of Ap Bac, the lead elements take fire from VC positions and immediately stop advancing while returning fire with their 50 caliber machine guns, and Captain Beer uses this contact as justification to halt the entire advance, claiming that pushing forward would expose his force to unacceptable danger. Captain Scanlon argues furiously that the task force must continue advancing because the armoured vehicles can easily withstand the small arms fire being directed at them, and because the whole purpose of armour is to close with enemy positions under fire and either destroy them or suppress them sufficiently to allow infantry to manoeuvre. but Baer simply refuses to move his vehicles forward, and no amount of argument or pleading can change his decision. The task force remains halted several hundred meters from Ap Bac, while the stranded helicopter crews continue calling desperately for help, and the Viet Cong fighters maintain their positions knowing that government forces lack the will to come and drive them out. This failure of Task Force A to advance represents the single most critical failure of the Battle of Ap Bac because these armoured vehicles possess both the protection and firepower needed to break the stalemate and rescue the stranded Americans. But the refusal of the Vietnamese commander to accept any risk or casualties means this decisive advantage is wasted, while American advisors can only watch in impotent rage as winnable battle becomes humiliating defeat through sheer lack of aggressive leadership and fighting spirit among South Vietnamese officers who are supposed to be allies in this struggle. The afternoon stalemate. Through the afternoon hours of January 2nd, the battle settles into frustrating stalemate, as government forces with overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower remain frozen in positions around Ap Bac while the approximately 300 Viet Cong fighters maintain their defensive positions and continue directing effective fire at any movement they observe. American advisors coordinate airstrikes by Vietnamese Air Force fighter bombers that drop bombs and napalm on suspected VC positions, but these attacks prove largely ineffective because the VC are well dispersed and concealed, and because the South Vietnamese pilots are reluctant to press their attacks closely enough to ensure accuracy when friendly forces are nearby. Artillery fire is called in repeatedly against Ap Bac village, with 105mm howitzers firing hundreds of rounds throughout the afternoon. But again, the effects prove minimal because the VC have prepared proper fighting positions that provide overhead cover, and because they remain disciplined in staying under cover between engagements, rather than exposing themselves unnecessarily. The combination of airstrikes and artillery fire destroys many of the village structures and creates impressive explosions and smoke that suggest devastating effect, but when the fires lift, the VC are still there, and still fighting and still holding their positions against all the technology and firepower that the government forces can bring to bear. Lieutenant Colonel Van continues coordinating from his observation aircraft and becomes increasingly vocal in his criticism of the ARVN commanders who refuse to maneuver or attack or take any action beyond sitting in place and firing ineffectively at an enemy they cannot see. He radios Colonel Dam at division headquarters and pleads for orders that will force subordinate commanders to advance. But Dam is a cautious political officer who fears casualties will reflect badly on his career, and he refuses to issue direct orders that might result in significant losses, even though the alternative is accepting defeat in battle against inferior force. The stranded helicopter crews and airborne soldiers remain in desperate situation throughout the afternoon, as VC fire keeps them pinned down behind minimal cover, while casualties mount slowly from accurate sniper fire and occasional coordinated volleys from multiple positions. Several Americans are wounded, including pilots and door gunners, and the wounded cannot be evacuated because no helicopters can land safely, and no ground forces are advancing to link up with the isolated positions. The trapped Americans use their radios to plead for help while describing their deteriorating tactical situation, and these calls are monitored by advisors and commanders throughout the region who are powerless to provide the assistance needed because they cannot compel South Vietnamese ground forces to move. As afternoon turns toward evening, it becomes clear that the Battle of Ap Bac is lost, despite overwhelming advantages enjoyed by government forces, and the reason is simple and devastating. South Vietnamese commanders at multiple levels have refused to fight aggressively or accept casualties or take risks necessary to accomplish mission objectives, and no amount of American advice or equipment or air support can compensate for this fundamental failure of leadership and courage. The technological superiority and numerical advantage that should have guaranteed victory means nothing when soldiers will not advance and officers will not lead, and the determination to avoid casualties overrides all other considerations, including the fate of stranded American helicopter crews who depend on South Vietnamese forces for rescue. The night escape. As darkness falls on January 2nd, the Viet Cong commander makes the decision to withdraw from Ap Bac under cover of night while government forces remain frozen in their positions, making no attempt to prevent this escape or to advance and secure the village. The VC fighters systematically disengage from their defensive positions and move out in small groups through gaps in the loose encirclement that government forces have failed to close properly, carrying their weapons and their wounded and whatever equipment they can take with them, while leaving their dead for government forces to count in the morning. The withdrawal is conducted professionally with rear guards maintaining positions to cover the movement of the main body until all have cleared the area, and by midnight essentially all VC forces have successfully escaped despite being surrounded by vastly superior numbers of government troops. At dawn, on January 3rd, when government forces finally advance cautiously into Ap Bac, they find the village abandoned except for dead bodies and expended brass casings and the debris of battle, and they discover that the enemy they failed to engage decisively throughout an entire day has simply walked away during the night, while they sat in their positions waiting for someone else to take the risks necessary to win. The stranded helicopter crews and airborne troops are finally able to move to safety after spending over 24 hours in desperate circumstances that should never have developed if South Vietnamese commanders had shown any willingness to maneuver and fight, and the exhausted and furious Americans have learned firsthand the enormous gap between official optimism about ARVN capabilities and the grim reality of working with allies who will not fight. The count and the lies. The official casualty reports from the Battle of Ap Bac tell a story that makes clear who won this engagement. Government forces suffered approximately 80 killed in action, including 3 Americans and over 100 wounded, while Viet Cong losses are claimed to be 18 killed with unknown wounded. These figures demonstrate conclusively that the VC inflicted far heavier casualties than they received, while accomplishing their objective of holding their position throughout the day, and then withdrawing successfully when they chose to do so. And by any objective military standard, this represents a clear tactical victory for the Viet Cong forces, who proved they can stand and fight against superior numbers and prevail through better leadership and greater determination. But the official reports flowing from Saigon to Washington tell a very different story, because American and South Vietnamese officials cannot acknowledge that a small VC force defeated government troops backed by American advisors and equipped with modern American weapons and supported by helicopters and airstrikes and artillery. The official version describes the Battle of Ap Bac as a government victory where aggressive ARVN forces engaged and destroyed a VC unit while inflicting heavy casualties and forcing them to flee, and the fact that 5 helicopters were shot down is downplayed as unfortunate but not significant, and certainly not indicative of any serious problems with ARVN performance or American advisory efforts. Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann refuses to accept these lies and speaks candidly to reporters about what actually happened at Ap Bac, describing the refusal of ARVN commanders to fight and the waste of American equipment and advisors trying to support forces that will not maneuver or attack or accept casualties necessary to win battles. His frank assessments create significant problems for senior American commanders who are invested in maintaining optimistic narrative about progress in Vietnam, and tensions develop between Vann and his superiors that will eventually lead to his relief and transfer. But his willingness to tell truth about ARVN deficiencies represents early warning about problems that will plague American efforts in Vietnam for the next decade. The international press coverage of the Battle of Ap Bac presents an embarrassing contrast to official optimism, as reporters who witnessed the battle or interviewed participants describe how a small VC force defeated much larger government force through superior fighting spirit and aggressive leadership, while ARVN troops refused to close with the enemy, and American advisors watched helplessly as tactical advantages were squandered through cowardice and incompetence. These press reports begin eroding public confidence in official statements about the war and contribute to growing skepticism about whether South Vietnam can be saved through American assistance when South Vietnamese forces themselves appear unwilling to fight for their own country. The lessons ignored. The Battle of Ap Bac offers multiple critical lessons that should have informed American strategy and policy in Vietnam, but these lessons are largely ignored by senior commanders and Washington officials who prefer maintaining optimistic illusions over confronting uncomfortable realities about their South Vietnamese allies. The most fundamental lesson is that technological superiority and numerical advantage mean nothing when soldiers lack the will to fight and officers lack the courage to lead, and no amount of American equipment or advice can compensate for these deficiencies in fighting spirit and aggressive leadership. The battle demonstrates that Viet Cong forces can stand and fight effectively in conventional engagements when they choose positions carefully and prepare defences properly and maintain discipline under fire, contradicting the assumption that government forces will inevitably prevail in any stand-up fight where superior firepower can be brought to bear. The VC proved at Ap Bac that small determined forces using terrain effectively and concentrating fire on critical targets can defeat much larger forces that maneuver hesitantly and refuse to press attacks home despite overwhelming advantages. The helicopter losses at Ap Bac reveal vulnerability of these aircraft when operating in landing zones covered by determined enemy fire, and this lesson should have led to changes in tactics and doctrine about how helicopters are employed and what kind of suppressive fires are necessary before attempting insertions in hot landing zones. But the immediate response is simply to provide more helicopters and more firepower, rather than fundamentally rethinking whether South Vietnamese ground forces can be relied upon to maneuver aggressively enough to exploit the mobility that helicopters provide. Most significantly, the Battle of Ap Bac exposes the fatal flaw in the advisory concept that will doom American efforts throughout the war. American advisors can provide advice and equipment and support, but they cannot provide the courage and leadership and fighting spirit that must come from South Vietnamese officers and soldiers themselves. And when these fundamental military qualities are absent, no amount of American assistance can create victory. The refusal of ARVN commanders to fight at Ap Bac foreshadows the performance that will be repeated in countless engagements over the next 12 years until final collapse in 1975. The strategic impact. Despite being a relatively small engagement involving only a few thousand troops and lasting only one day, the Battle of Ap Bac has strategic impact far beyond its tactical scale, because it represents the first clear evidence that the optimistic assessments being presented to Washington and to the American public about progress in Vietnam are fundamentally wrong. The battle proves that Viet Cong forces can defeat government troops in conventional combat through superior fighting spirit and leadership, and it demonstrates that South Vietnamese forces equipped with American weapons and supported by American advisors are not capable of accomplishing mission objectives when they require aggressive maneuver and acceptance of casualties. For the Viet Cong, the victory at Ap Bac provides enormous propaganda value and boosts morale throughout their organization, because they have proven in clear and undeniable fashion that they can stand against government forces and prevail, and this encourages their strategy of engaging in larger conventional battles rather than limiting themselves to guerrilla harassment and small unit actions. The willingness to stand and fight that VC forces demonstrate at Ap Bac becomes a pattern that will be repeated at increasing scale throughout the war as they grow progressively more confident in their ability to defeat ARVN forces in conventional combat. For American advisors and policymakers, Ap Bac should have prompted fundamental reassessment of whether the advisory approach can succeed when Allied forces lack basic will to fight, but instead the response is to provide more equipment and more advisors and more support in hope that somehow additional American assistance will compensate for South Vietnamese deficiencies. This pattern of escalating commitment without addressing fundamental problems will characterize American involvement throughout the war, as each failure prompts increased investment rather than honest assessment of whether the strategy can possibly succeed, given the weaknesses of the South Vietnamese government and military. The battle also affects American press coverage of the war, as reporters become more skeptical of official optimism after witnessing the gap between what they observe on battlefields like Ap Bac and what senior commanders and officials claim in press conferences and reports. The credibility gap that develops between official statements and observable reality will widen over subsequent years, as more battles like Ap Bac demonstrate that the war is not being won despite constant assurances to the contrary. And this erosion of public trust in official statements about Vietnam becomes a critical factor in eventual loss of American public support for the war. The aftermath and legacy. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Ap Bac, senior American commanders attempt to minimize the significance of what happened and to suppress criticism of ARVN performance, but Lieutenant Colonel Van and other advisors who witnessed the battle refused to remain silent about the serious deficiencies they observed. Van's frank assessments to reporters and in official channels create tension with his superiors who are committed to maintaining narrative of progress and success, and this conflict eventually contributes to his decision to leave active duty, although he will return to Vietnam as a civilian advisor and will continue working to support the war effort until his death in a helicopter crash in 1972. The lessons of Ap Bac are essentially ignored by senior leadership, as the advisory effort continues along the same lines that failed so spectacularly on January 2nd, and over the following months, and years similar patterns of ARVN reluctance to maneuver and fight will repeat in engagement after engagement, while American advisors grow increasingly frustrated with allies who will not use the advantages being provided to them. The fundamental problems of poor leadership and lack of fighting spirit among ARVN forces that were so clearly demonstrated at Ap Bac will persist throughout the war and will ultimately prove decisive in determining the final outcome. For the Viet Cong and later the North Vietnamese forces, the Battle of Ap Bac becomes a celebrated victory that is studied and commemorated as an example of how inferior forces can defeat superior ones through determination and aggressive leadership. And the tactics employed by the VC at Ap Bac, including standing and fighting in prepared positions and concentrating fire on helicopters and using terrain effectively, will be refined and employed at larger scale in subsequent battles. The confidence gained from this victory encourages progressively more ambitious operations that will eventually escalate into the conventional warfare of the later war years. The 5 helicopters shot down at Ap Bac represent more than just material losses, because they demonstrate vulnerability of American technology and tactics when employed against determined enemy forces and when South Vietnamese ground forces cannot be relied upon to support and exploit the mobility that helicopters provide. The image of American helicopters burning in rice paddies while ARVN forces refuse to advance and rescue the crews becomes a powerful symbol of the problems that will plague the entire war effort, and the lessons about how helicopters can be defeated through concentrated fire by determined enemies armed with relatively simple weapons will be applied by VC and NVA forces in countless engagements throughout the war. The forgotten first defeat. The Battle of Ap Bac is often forgotten in popular memory of the Vietnam War because it was overshadowed by much larger and bloodier battles that followed over the next 12 years. But it deserves recognition as the first clear defeat suffered by American advisory efforts, and as the first major engagement that exposed the fatal flaws in the strategy of supporting South Vietnamese forces who lack the will to fight effectively. The pattern established at Ap Bac of South Vietnamese reluctance to maneuver and accept casualties, combined with American technological support proving insufficient to compensate for these deficiencies, will repeat throughout the war at increasing scale until final collapse in 1975. The approximately 300 Viet Cong fighters who stood their ground at Ap Bac on January 2, 1963, proved that they could defeat government forces 10 times their number through superior leadership and fighting spirit and tactical skill, and in doing so they foreshadowed the eventual outcome of the war because they demonstrated that the advantages of modern weapons and American support cannot overcome the disadvantages of Allied forces who will not fight. The battle should have prompted fundamental questions about whether the advisory approach could succeed and whether the South Vietnamese government and military possessed the capability and will to defend their country even with American assistance. But these questions were not seriously addressed, and the consequences of ignoring them became tragically clear over the following years. January 2, 1963, at the obscure village of Ap Bac in the Mekong Delta, where 300 Viet Cong fighters defeated 2,000 government troops supported by American advisors and helicopters and airstrikes and artillery, where 5 helicopters fell to concentrated small arms fire, while ARVN ground forces refused to advance and rescue the crews, where the first clear defeat in what would become America's longest war demonstrated that technology and advice cannot substitute for courage and leadership and will to fight. The Battle of Ap Bac was the first defeat but not the last, and the lessons it offered about the fatal weaknesses in American strategy were ignored until it was far too late to avoid the ultimate defeat that those 300 VC fighters at Ap Bac foreshadowed on that January day in 1963.